Okay, I've got 9:45. It's about time to get started. This seems like a very well-behaved group. Other conferences, I can't get people to stop talking. But can't hear me? Oh, well, where's the audio genius? That's better? Oh, I'm supposed to be speaking through this thing here. How's this? You can hear that? Okay. I'll yell better. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Welcome to everybody. I have a few opening remarks to make about this. Did we pay someone else to speak at this time? There's somebody talking back there. Give him a microphone. Okay. I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank all of our donors who made this event possible, including our host committee, Steve Berger, Brian Lee Briggs, Jerry Dowell, William Ramagosa, and Steve and Cassandra Torello. Thank you very much for your tremendous generosity of making this possible. And I also want to thank our speaker sponsors, William Brennan. Wasn't he a famous actor? No, it was Walter Brennan. William Brennan. Paul Dietrich, James Fitzgerald, the Armstrong Foundation, Charles Hatch, Dan and Tracy Hubble, Greg Hill, Mark and Lane Murrah, who are with us today, Don Prince, who's with us today. I haven't seen the other guys. Russell Rich and Jerry Williams. Thank you very much for your generosity. Revisionist history of war. In a sense, I'm going to make a few comments about this before I get started. In a sense, all history is revisionist history. In some of my research regarding Lincoln and the Civil War, I got to know the literature of a lot of the Lincoln scholars, as they call themselves. I call them the Lincoln cult, but they're the Lincoln scholars. But every one of them has written 3, 4, 5, 10 books on Lincoln. Well, why would you need to write another book on Lincoln unless you're a revisionist? You're revising something. You know, new knowledge, a different interpretation, new facts come about. And so all of history is revisionist history as far as that goes. And so, but the establishment are gatekeepers. When my book, The Real Lincoln, first came out more than 20 years ago, and I knew what was going to happen. I knew I was going to kick over a hornet's nest and called all kind of bad names and everything like that, but I didn't care. Paul Craig Roberts wrote me an email that said, "You've destroyed their human capital. That's why they're attacking you." The establishment interpretation of all that. They spent 30, 40, 50 years writing book after book after book about St. Lincoln, and then I come along and I just lay out these facts and it contradicts them. That's why, for example, when Judge Napolitano was invited to be on the Daily Show, television show, to talk about Lincoln, because he wrote about Lincoln in one of his books on the Constitution, he sent me a list of questions that they gave him. And then when he showed up, they had Eric Foner from Columbia and a whole bunch of people to argue with him. And he said, the first thing Eric Foner asked him was, "Do you know DiLorenzo?" So he wanted to know, he wanted to know if he knew anything about Lincoln, because if he said no, then he could just keep on lying through his teeth like he's been doing for 45 years. But anyway, the establishment wants you to think that all revisionist history is like Holocaust denial, because they call those people revisionists, and they call themselves revisionists, and so they want to kind of smear you any way they can with that. But it's all this way. The second point I'd like to make about this, about the revisionist history, is some things that Mises said, that history is just a collection of facts. And you have to interpret the facts in some way. Mises also said economic history is also just a collection of facts and statistics, but if you don't have some sort of guiding theory that makes sense, then everything's open to ad hoc interpretations, and tomorrow's interpretation can be totally different than today's interpretation. And Mises was making the argument that praxeology is especially important, and that's been for my whole career. That's very important. You have to have an economic worldview if you're going to talk about something like war. It's not the only worldview. It's not the only view, but you have to be somewhat equipped with that. And also, you combine that with the Rothbardian view of the state. You'll ask very different questions when you're studying history, and you'll come up with very different interpretations than you do. When I first started getting into that whole literature on Lincoln and the Civil War and the economics of the Civil War, I was in Baltimore, and I took a course at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and they had all the big shot Ivy League lecturers on the Civil War there. And I started asking them, what book or books would you recommend on Lincoln's economic policies? Because every president has some economic policies, and none of them mentioned a word about it. And they gave me this one book. They all said there's this one book. That's the book. Read that book. Lincoln and the American Dream, it's called. And I read it, and it had silly things like Lincoln was a lifelong advocate of protectionist tariffs because he wanted the common man to have a chance to become wealthy like he had become wealthy. And it was just total BS. And that's one of the reasons why I got into that. And that's the sort of things they wanted to preserve. So if you have just an inkling of education and economics, you would dismiss all of this in a second. In that book, let alone some of the more sophisticated arguments. So those are two things I'd like to mention about this that I think, in my opinion, all good history is revisionist history. When I first started researching Lincoln, I quoted Lerone Bennett Jr. as saying there'd already been, I think he said there were 16,000 books in print on Lincoln at the time. So that's a lot of revisionism, isn't it? 16,000 books. Okay, and so we're not doing anything unusual here today or this week, and so those are basically my introductory comments for now about what we're doing here. And now on to my topic. I'm a little ahead of the schedule, but that's okay. We can have a little Q&A maybe. Let's see. I don't want to get things mixed up here. Well, my topic, I've talked about this at another conference here, but we're publishing this as a book. And by the way, it's not too late to be a sponsor of the book. Just find Christy Holmes, our Director of Development, talk to her about that. And so I've talked about this before, but I decided this is what I want to write my chapter on in the book. Okay, it's called False Virtue. And as I said, I've talked about this before. Some of you have heard parts of this talk before, but I'm going to rewrite this and write it into the book chapter. And so even if we have to transcribe all the speeches, we're going to publish this as a book, all the presentations from here. Well, it starts with the famous writer, Robert Penn Warren, who, he's the author of All the King's Men. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that. He's also a poet. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. He was a Southern agrarian. In 1960, I think it was Life magazine, invited him to write a book on the centennial of the Civil War, or which I prefer to call the War to Prevent Southern Independence. Okay, and this is the little book he came up with. It's called The Legacy of the Civil War. This little blue book, very interesting. He was a very brilliant man. And he said that the government used the war as a way of giving itself a treasury of virtue. The United States government was said to have a treasury of virtue. He said this, this is a quote, the war gave Northerners, who ran the government, after the war, a plenary indulgence for all sins, past, present, and future. Wow. So they were so virtuous at the end of the war, after slaughtering hundreds of thousands of fellow citizens, that there were a plenary indulgence for anything the U.S. government would do forevermore, because it was the U.S. government that was doing it. And he also said that whenever there's a dispute about such things, if one side claims a monopoly of virtue, that historically has been used to do just about anything. You know, the mass murder of women and children, the bombing of cities occupied by civilians, whatever, because you've got the monopoly on a virtue and the other side does not. So he warned about that. And then he said, but you have to forget a lot of history in order to believe that the US government, under people like U.S. Grant or William McKinley or people like that, are the most virtuous people on planet Earth. You have to forget a lot of actual Civil War history. And here's what Robert Penn Warren said in his book about what must be forgotten. It must be forgotten that the Republican Party platform pledged the protection of slavery, which it did. Republicans were ready to guarantee slavery in the Constitution, which they were. Lincoln himself endorsed the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which would have prevented the federal government from ever interfering in slavery. And he did so in his first inaugural address, right there, named after an Ohio congressman. Both houses of Congress announced that the war was not about slavery, but saving the Union. That was the Crittenden-Johnson resolution, also known as the War Aims Resolution. They announced to the world that we have no intention in disturbing the domestic institutions of the states, by which they meant slavery. So you have to forget about that. You're not allowed to know that. Okay, you have to forget that the Emancipation Proclamation emancipated no one, because it only applied to rebel territory. It even, including West Virginia, the last slave state to enter the Union, seceding illegally, by the way, because it didn't involve the Virginia legislature, as the Constitution requires, by the Lincoln administration. And all the parishes in Louisiana where the Union Army was in control were specifically exempted by name from the Emancipation Proclamation. And when I visited the Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, Illinois, they had in one of the rooms, they had a big video display, and they had the face of an ex-slave and then a voiceover of his words saying, "We heard about this proclamation, but we didn't think anything of it because we were still slaves." So they knew, maybe the American public was bamboozled, one of Murray Rothbard's favorite words, but the slaves weren't. Most northern states refused Negro suffrage after the war, Robert Penn Warren wrote. I imagine the Lincoln cult would say, well, we don't want Negroes to suffer. Why would, who wants that? Who wants that to happen? After the war, during the war, Sherman opposed arming of black people. Lincoln famously said in a debate with Stephen Douglas, and this is a direct quote of Lincoln, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the black and white races. I, as much as any man, want the superior position to belong to the white race." You can't get much more of a white supremacist than that. He even used the word superior in that. So the people during Lincoln's time knew him and knew that. That's what was known. But Robert Penn Warren says you need to forget all of this. You need to forget all of that. You just need to believe what I was taught in Pennsylvania public school, that Lincoln was so honest that he once walked 6 miles to return a penny to a merchant who he had underpaid, and then 6 miles back home. And I don't remember my teacher at the time saying that it was uphill both ways, but it probably was. Yeah. One of the very first biographies of Lincoln after his death actually said that his mother was the most chaste woman since the Virgin Mary herself. And it also said in the same book that his father was illiterate and the only book he ever read was the Bible. And so Robert Penn Warren goes on to say, the treasury of virtue is a consciously undertaken crusade so full of righteousness that there is enough overplus stored in heaven, like the deeds of the saints, to take care of all the small failings of the descendants of the Crusaders. Well, the descendants of the Crusaders, think Hillary Rodham Clinton or some pick your descendant. And Clyde Wilson called Hillary once a museum quality specimen of a Yankee. You think of looking at some weird bug under a glass. There's Hillary's face right there. And then the final thing about him he's going to say is the effect of the treasury of virtue is to make us lie automatically. We repeat all this stuff over and over and over again, and we all lie automatically. And this all morphed into American exceptionalism, which was used as always to this day used as the reason for never-ending bombardment of people all over the world. And the real American foreign policy for a long time was captured perfectly in a bumper sticker that I saw in Baltimore once when I was living there. It had an American flag on one corner, and it said, "Do as we say, or we will bring democracy to your country." And that's basically, but in the treasury of virtue is what's supposed to justify all of this. And it's not a surprise, by the way, that the descendants, or the ancestors of these people, or the people who conducted the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, it's the same sort of zealot idea that we are morally superior to everyone else, and we therefore have a right to do anything, set women on fire who we don't like. And, I can think of a few I would recommend if I was around back then to do that too. So what did they do with all this virtue? I'm going to be way ahead of our schedule here, but I guess that's okay. I'm only supposed to be starting now. Maybe we should all take a 10-minute nap. Let's see how that goes.
It's okay. I always go over time.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, Scott goes over time. Yeah, we got a lot of big mouths on the agenda today, as far as that goes. So what did they do with all this virtue? All this great virtue. Another book I would recommend. There's a little book called The Deification of Lincoln, if you're interested in this. Published in 1943 by Ira Cardiff, Cardiff. And there aren't that many books about this. Well, how did this come about? In his own time, there's a book on Lincoln that says that he was the most hated and reviled of all American presidents. It's Larry Tagg is the author of that one, and based on magazine articles, newspaper articles, and things during his time. But then this was all transformed by the Republican Party and the clergy. Okay, and there was one lithograph that I used to have in my files somewhere of a Harper's Magazine article in 1866, and it was an angel ascending to heaven, big angel's wings, and below the angel there was an open tomb, and then the head of the angel was Abraham Lincoln. So, and they would said things like he died on Good Friday, which is true, and they said things like. They compared him to Jesus Christ, and then sometimes they compared him to Moses by saying he led his people to the promised land, but he never made it there himself. And so that's the kind of nonsense for decades Americans were subjected to, and that's how the treasury of virtue was cemented into place over the years, until I came along. I could brag on that. So what did they do with all this virtue that was built up during the war? Well, the first thing they did was 3 months after the war ended, General Sherman, a delightful fellow, was put in charge of the military district of the Missouri, which was all land west of the Mississippi, and his basic assignment was to commence a war of genocide against the Plains Indians, which lasted for 25 years, more or less under his supervision. And they ended up killing some 45,000 Indians. And Sherman early on made this statement. This is from a biography by Michael Fellman, a biography of Sherman. Sherman himself said, "We are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians check and stop the progress of the railroads." And of course, Lincoln was a wealthy railroad attorney, the general counsel of the Illinois Central. He represented all the big railroads in the Midwest. He was offered the job of general counsel of the New York Central by Erasmus Corning. He turned it down because he had bigger, that was 1857, I think. And so the whole railroad industry was linked. There's a book called Lincoln and the Railroads, if anybody's interested in it. I think it was John Starr. I know the last name was Starr with 2 R's, but I forget the first, I don't know can't remember the first name was John or something else, but you can find it if you want to look for it. And so that's what Sherman's job was to do. And at the time, the government was, when the war broke out in June of 1861, Lincoln called the Congress back to Washington. And here's Robert E. Lee amassing a giant army a few miles away. And what is the subject? To get the legislation started on the Pacific Railway bill. And we got to start paying off the people who put us in office. And so they did, and they gave the president the right to determine where they would start building the transcontinental railroad. The government subsidized transcontinental railroads, and he had 3 years earlier he had invested in a big piece of land in Council Bluffs, Iowa, personally. Where do you think he chose the starting point? Any guess? Anyone want to guess? And to this day, it's called Lincoln's Hill in the Council Bluffs. And I always thought that's probably why he turned the job down of the general counsel of the New York Central Railroad, because he knew he was hoping he was going to make a killing, which I'm sure he did on that railroad. And so that was the beginning of the War of the Plains Indians, because they wanted to make way for the railroads. And that's one thing that Sherman said about that. Then Michael Feldman, the historian, writing about Sherman, he said, the great triumvirate of the Union Civil War effort, Generals Grant, Sherman, and Philip Sheridan, pursued what Sherman called the final solution to the Indian problem. And I've quoted that, and all people have asked me, is that where Hitler got this? Who knows? Maybe. Hitler did quote Lincoln's first inaugural address in Mein Kampf, though. He said something to the effect that the states did not create the Union created the states. And Hitler kind of liked that idea, because he wanted to destroy all the states in Germany and have one big centralized power. I wrote that in an article after I debated Harry Jaffa, and he told me that he said DiLorenzo would probably agree with Hitler on this stuff. So I wrote an article about how Jaffa is his views are identical to Hitler's views on federalism, state rights, and I think I called it Jaffa's Hitlerian defense of Hitler. If you can look it up on LouRockwell.com. The day after I got home from Oakland, California, I wrote that up. Because I remembered it as an undergraduate, I had a European history class, and they gave us readings of Mein Kampf, and so there might be a picture out there somewhere of me walking around a campus with a copy of Mein Kampf. So my critics would love that. Would love to get that. Okay. So anyway, the final solution to the Indian problem. They were joined by other Union Army luminaries such as John Pope, O.O. Howard, George Armstrong Custer, Benjamin Grierson, and Winfield Scott Hancock. And like I said, they eventually killed, the historians say, at least 45,000 Plains Indians. And this included the women and children. Of course, they would sneak up on Indian villages in the wintertime when they knew families would all be together. And by then they had Gatling guns and rifled cannon, and they would just obliterate everybody, animals included. And they also had a sort of a massive killing of buffaloes in the plains, because the Indians relied on buffaloes for everything, food, clothing. They even used the tiny little bones for fish hooks. And they would, if a baby was born in the middle of winter, they would kill a buffalo and gut it and put the baby inside the carcass to keep it from freezing to death. They used the buffalo for everything. And so part of the U.S. policy was the decimation of the buffalo herds. It wasn't just the tragedy of the commons, like economists talk about, that the shooting of the buffalo. It was government policy to try to starve to death the Plains Indians at the same time. And these are the people who were supposed to be racial saints. And they also recruited ex-slaves, and they named them Buffalo Soldiers, and they make movies about them, and they're all heroes, but they were waging genocide against another different race, basically, and being paid for it. Sherman, of course, justified all this. This is, his use of the treasury of virtue was what all of this was done in the shadow of. And here's a quote from Sherman. The Indians give a fair illustration of the fate of the Negroes if they are released from the control of the whites. That was General Sherman saying that, our racial saint. And Mises, by the way, when he wrote about imperialism, he noted that imperialist powers, whether it's Germany or Russia or even the U.S., they always seem to pick first on countries where they call the people the lesser races. It took them a while to have the nerve to wage war against other people who they thought were of their own enlightened race. And so this would be a good example of what Mises was talking about, I think. And Michael Feldman, the biographer, said Sherman's war in the Plains Indians had the objective of a racial cleansing, quotes, a racial cleansing of the land. And then it quotes Sherman again as saying this: all the Indians will have to be killed or maintained as a species of paupers. Well, they achieved that, didn't they? To this day, there's Indian reservations. Last time I was in Montana, I drove by a lot of them, and they still have Indian reservations. And he said, and they must be obliterated or beg for mercy. Those are Sherman's words. And Sherman actually gave Sheridan, Sherman was sitting back there in Washington, and Sheridan was the executioner, Philip Sheridan, the man who burned out the Shenandoah Valley after the Confederate Army left during the war, and burned down all the private homes and things like that. He gave this order from Sherman: authorization to slaughter as many women and children as well as men, because he said it would be too time-consuming to distinguish between men, the braves versus the squaws and the children. So just kill everybody. Where have I heard that recently? Okay, and then this gem from Sherman. This is a letter. After a couple of years of this, Sherman writes General Sheridan a letter saying, quote, I am charmed at the handsome conduct of our troops in the field. Charming, he's very charmed all that. There's a man named S.L.A. Marshall who was the official government historian of the history of the European theater of war in World War II. He wrote 35 books on American military history. And he said this about Sherman's order to Sheridan during the Indian Wars. He said, he called it, quote, and I'm quoting S.L.A. Marshall, it was the most brutal orders ever published to American troops, about Sherman to Sheridan, about just kill everybody. So that's the first thing the government did with this treasury of virtue that they claim to have developed by the war, the war to prevent Southern independence. And then moving along, another example of this is Trump's favorite president, William McKinley. And we had the American conquest of the Philippines, basically, when the Filipinos had finally gotten rid of the Spanish Empire, and the Americans come along and said, hold on there, you're going to become a part of our empire. And they ended up killing, some history books say 200,000 Filipinos. There's some historians say it could have been 1 million Filipinos who just didn't want to be part of anybody else's empire. It's called the Philippine Insurrection. And Teddy Roosevelt, who Bill Clinton once said is his favorite Republican president, was involved in all of this. Jim Powell, my old friend Jim Powell, wrote a biography called Bully Boy of Teddy Roosevelt. And he became president after William McKinley, who was, like I said, Trump's favorite president, was assassinated. Okay, and he justified the mass slaughter of the Filipinos by saying, in fact, Jim Powell says, in the same way that the Southerners during the War of the States were dehumanized. That's always what these people always do. They always have to dehumanize the people they're about to try to obliterate. He said, Teddy Roosevelt denounced the Filipinos as, and I'm quoting Teddy Roosevelt now, as Chinese half-breeds, savages, barbarians, a wild and ignorant people, a lesser race. So he actually uses the same phrase that Mises used in Human Action, the lesser races there. And so, and he also said, and then there was a United States Senator, Albert Beveridge of Indiana. He said, the Philippines are ours forever now. The Pacific Ocean is ours. And so, raw imperialism all of a sudden pops up. And another senator, Ben Tillman, joined Beveridge, and he said, the Filipinos are a people racially unfit to govern themselves. Okay. There was another thing that Beveridge said is that it is our duty, this is a quote of Senator Beveridge, our duty to bring Christianity and civilization to a savage and senile people. Well, at that time, the United States was about 100 years old, a little over 100 years old, but Filipinos had been Catholics for about 400 years at that point. So we're going to bring Christianity to the Philippines. He said. So that's kind of dingbats. They're senators after all. What do you expect? They're in the United States Senate. What do you expect them to say? Okay. Getting back to Teddy Roosevelt again, Jim Powell says that he's always talking about the importance of racial superiority, Teddy Roosevelt. And he said this, all great masterful races have been warlike races. And he denounced what he called the menace of peace. That's Teddy Roosevelt. And shortly after that, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. You can't make this stuff up. It's like Obama getting the Nobel Peace Prize one day after he was elected president, or whenever that was. It was pretty fast. He couldn't have made anything, done anything for peace. But yeah, okay. Well, the Philippine insurrection followed the brief Spanish-American War, who Teddy called a splendid little war. And he reversed himself, though, after one of his sons was shot down in World War I and died. And he was no longer such a lunatic on war. And on this topic, I quote the famous libertarian scholar from Yale University, William Graham Sumner, wrote this famous essay, The Conquest of the United States by Spain, about all of this that's going on. Remember, my theme is that it's the treasury of virtue that provides the cover for all of this. It's a plenary indulgence of all sins, past, present, and future. The treasury of virtue, American exceptionalism. And Sumner, a few quotes from Sumner. He said, all of a sudden, there was to be, in old America, he said, there was no grand diplomacy. You know, when you turn on the news on TV and you see Marco Rubio or somebody, they're diplomats. They're going to negotiate with somebody. That didn't exist like it does today. Of course, they had negotiations and treaties, but there wasn't so much of it. But William Graham Sumner claims this sort of started an upward trend in the grand diplomacy, because a lot of Americans still believed in the Jeffersonian dictum of leaving foreigners, don't getting involved in foreign alliances and foreign entanglements, and let people solve their own problems. And so if you believe that, you don't need to send Marco Rubio all around. Leave the poor man alone. Let him spend time with his family a little bit. Don't send him on a jet every other day to be a diplomat. Okay, but then with the Spanish-American War, William Graham Sumner said, well, we established this, that the new policy direction was to be war, debt, taxation, diplomacy, a grand governmental system, pomp, glory, a big army and navy, lavish expenditures, political jobbery, cronyism, talk to Patrick Newman about that, in a word, imperialism. So he argued that's why he called this essay The Conquest of the United States by Spain, and that we turned into imperialists, just like the Spanish Empire and the British Empire. And I've argued in some of my writings that was the real purpose of some of the agitators for the Civil War, is they wanted to create an empire on par with the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the other empires in the world. And so that was another early use of the treasury of virtue. And then there's the conquest and subjugation of Hawaii. The American government in the 1890s rather, they plotted to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy. They created something called a committee of safety. That could be another bumper sticker. Do as we say, or we will organize a committee of safety for your country. that's a committee of politicians in their language. And so and this was all businessmen, American businessmen who were behind this. And they sent an envoy named John Stevens, who arranged for American troops to land in Hawaii. And they placed a judge named Sanford Dole as sort of the head of a puppet government in Hawaii. It's easy to create a government if you've got more guns than the people who are currently running the government does, I guess. And they formed a paramilitary organization called the Honolulu Rifles. And they literally forced the Hawaiian king to sign a new constitution, literally at bayonet point. And it came to be known as the Bayonet Constitution. So here's the Americans. This is 1890s. I mean, it's 1789 because our Constitution is ratified, and with everything that goes along with it. And a century later, here they are forcing a new constitution literally at bayonet point on the Hawaiians. And I guess they didn't really believe in American constitutionalism in those days. And so he signed it. It disenfranchised all the Asians, so that basically the wealthy American landowners had the upper hand in Hawaiian politics. And then a cousin of Sanford Dole, the judge that was put ahead of the new government, his cousin founded the Dole Fruit Company. Well, what a coincidence! So if you go buy some Dole pineapple juice this afternoon, that was the beginning of it. And again, it was the treasury of virtue that's behind all of this. Whatever we do is virtuous by virtue of the fact that it's the U.S. government that is doing it. And this is all in the decades immediately after the Civil War. Another good Teddy Roosevelt quote was that about this. He made a speech in Boston. It was very well received, it is said, in Jim Powell's book. And Teddy said, "I feel that it was a crime against the white race that we did not annex Hawaii 3 years ago." They dragged their feet. And because Grover Cleveland got elected president, he wasn't for this. But he was only in one term. This was his second term there. Okay. And one final thing, I'm taking up all my time after all. One final thing that I'll point out about this whole era, the whole period, the use of the treasury of virtue, is the famous essay by Marine Corps General Smedley Butler. That a lot of you know about this. War is a Racket is the name. It's online. Anybody can read it if you've never seen this. And so this is a man he's said to be the most highly decorated Marine Corps officer in U.S. history. This is a World War I era, turn of the century era Marine. And he wrote this book after he's in his retirement, this little book. He said this about his career. He said, "I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests. Very sarcastic, of course. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar corporations." And so in his retirement, he decided his whole career that's what he risked his life for all those years, and was given all those medals and congratulations as being sort of the hand of imperialism, around the neck of all these people, Nicaragua, Cuba, Mexico, everywhere. And so I guess there are lessons for us today from all this. I'll let you conclude with think about what all of your lessons are from all of this. But that was the turning point. If you want to know the use of the treasury of virtue, it was to carry out the agenda, which I think was always the agenda of the people who wanted a civil war in the first place, is to create an empire, an imperialistic empire, and a mercantilist empire, which was always the dream of Alexander Hamilton, by the way, and the Hamiltonians, a mercantilist empire that would rival the British Empire. And Hamilton himself was badgering George Washington to go to war with Spain during his day. And so he would have been very welcomed in the McKinley administration, I would think, if he lived that long. And our old friend Gary North, these are all his books, by the way. The late Gary North, he once told me that he once started a little club called the Aaron Burr Club. And Aaron Burr's the man who shot Hamilton to death, and they had ball caps. And on the back of the ball caps, it said, "Not soon enough." On the back of the ball caps. So I think I'll end there, and we'll bring Scott Horton. I'm going to introduce Scott in a second. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for all coming. Okay, our next speaker. We're going to have a break after Scott. Our next speaker is Scott Horton. He's the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and a host of the Scott Horton Show. And you can get it on scotthorton.org. He's the author of 4 books. He has a recent one that's for sale downstairs. He's conducted more than 6,000 interviews since 2003, and he and his wife live in Austin, Texas. And so, Scott, come on up here.
All right, thank y'all very much. Get my Homer Simpson reading glasses on here for you. All right. So first of all, thank you so much to Tom DiLorenzo and Lou Rockwell especially for having me here today. It's my first time at the Mises Institute. I'm very excited to be here. And as Tom mentioned, I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. And as such, I have to admit that I have Institute envy pretty bad here today. Mark Thornton gave me the big tour this morning. This is the most impressive institution in the world. It's my dream that the Libertarian Institute could ever be anything like a rival or a peer to the Mises Institute. It's really great and has, of course, been probably the most important libertarian institution as long as I've been interested in the subject, which would be going back to at least the 1990s. But I do have some news. It's not exactly to rival the Ludwig von Mises Institute, but I do have a new project. It's I put together with the help of a friend of mine, Tom Woods. You guys might have heard of him. And Tom Woods has built me my own Liberty Classroom. It's called the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom. And it'll be debuting next month. And so it's going to be 2 big courses by me on the war on terrorism and the Cold War with Russia. It's going to be Jim Bovard on 40 years of investigative journalism, Ramsey Baroud on Israel-Palestine, Richard Booth on the true story behind the Oklahoma City bombing, William Bupert on how America lost every war since 1945, and the great C.J. Kilmer as well on how Woodrow Wilson is the worst human who ever existed. So the website is scotthortonacademy.com. You can start entering your email addresses now and get ready for that. It's coming very soon. And huge thank you to Tom Woods for that. All right, now, anti-imperialism, of course, is an essential part of the libertarian movement and the political philosophy of libertarianism. Of course, Murray Rothbard wrote that war is the key to the whole libertarian business. Well, that's how we pronounce it where I'm from. And of course, that's true because you can't have a world empire and a limited government at home, never mind, anarcho-capitalism and the Ancapistan we all dream of. But how could you have anything like a limited government at home when you have a world empire abroad, and in fact, the most dominant world empire in all of history? As my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Keith Knight, wrote, it requires a state of domestic imperialism here at home, for the government to keep us all in line enough, if for nothing else, to raise the revenue and the armies to wage their world empire. We might find, if we abandon the empire, that we don't really need Washington, D.C. that much at all. We could start to abolish all of these major departments and agencies and roll all these authorities back to the states and to the people, like the Bill of Rights says. And so, of course, anti-imperialism is at the heart of libertarianism. It has to be. How could we possibly have a limited government with a world empire? Now, in 1969, there was famously, and through 1970, there's a famous break in the Young Americans for Freedom, where the libertarians at the big convention in St. Louis in '69 walked out over Vietnam. So we are not going to support this. And then by 1971, some of the refugees from Young Americans for Freedom had created the Libertarian Party, and with anti-imperialism at the core of its platform. Of course, as it had to be. And as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, very famously and importantly, Murray Rothbard in 1978 published the Libertarian Manifesto. And included in there is Chapter 11, War and Foreign Policy, where he breaks down a full revisionist take on the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, when at least back then they still were a gigantic communist empire. But he went and explained from the free market point of view why we need not have this Cold War, even with the Soviet communists. And of course, you know, in later times, in the 1990s, it was the libertarians who led the opposition to the wars in the Balkans, and which were so complicated and so few even understood. But the libertarians did. They cared a lot about it, and they opposed intervention there in Bosnia-Herzegovina and later in the Kosovo War. And it was during the Kosovo War that antiwar.com really grew into its own. They'd been created by Eric Garris, founded the site at the end of 1995. And they had done, you know, some coverage, but it was really in the Kosovo War of 1999 where they came into their own. And this is when I first found antiwar.com. I still remember to this day my friend Shauna showing me, hey, look at this site. And it was Christmas time, because I remember there were like Christmas decorations around. I guess it must have been late '98, before the Balkan War had actually started. And she said, look at this, and it has a big red logo at the top, antiwar.com. And I still remember, I said to her, oh, what is this, some kind of socialist thing? And she goes, no, look. And she pages down, look, they run Ron Paul. I go, no way, because I've been a Ron Paul guy since '97. So, all right, they run Ron Paul at antiwar.com. And then she goes, and look, click, and a couple clicks through. And this actually wasn't on antiwar.com, but it was a couple clicks through led to Lincoln, the American Lenin by L. Neil Smith. And I went, wow, they're not just libertarians, but they're right-wing, anti-government, hardcore libertarians. And they own the URL, antiwar.com. Oh my God, it's so important. And I didn't catch on to reading Raimondo then. I didn't really have the internet regularly for another couple of years. But it was so important to me to know that there are free market capitalists who own that URL, were holding down that website and that work. And then, of course, so speaking of Justin Raimondo was the founding editorial director of antiwar.com, and of course, Murray Rothbard's heir on foreign policy. I know from Eric Garris that there's a lot of Rothbard on foreign policy that was actually written by Justin, and there's a lot of Justin on foreign policy that was actually written by Murray Rothbard, because they would cover for each other a lot back in those days. And then he was my mentor, and my job was filling Justin's articles with all those links all those years. So I accept responsibility. Sorry about that, and also you're welcome. I know it was a bit of overkill. I kind of can't help myself. And antiwar.com is still going strong, and we have a whole new generation of guys at the site as well. And of course, our foreign policy in America is still horrible enough that we need it. So antiwar.com is still there. And now, I gotta say, even the regime libertarians in Washington, D.C. have been pretty good on foreign policy. They haven't been the best, and there's been plenty to fight about, and many of them got Iraq War II wrong. But then they all had to eat their hat and say that they were sorry. People like Breek Lindsay at Reason Magazine and some others, they had to admit that that was completely crazy to say that America has to overthrow the whole world and make it all free before we can have freedom in our own country. It's insane. And it proved to, of course, not be anything like true. We've all lost our freedom as our government has waged this world empire. So there were a few, but most of them apologized. But recently, just since the Ukraine-Russia war started, we've had some backsliding among the regime libertarians. And Ted Galen Carpenter, who was the single best guy at Cato, got fired for being good on Ukraine. And you may have seen a letter that was written to Cato by a group of libertarian institutions. And the signatures in the name of the institutions at the bottom of the letter was this long. And yet I never heard of any of these people. The Friedrich von Hayek Institute of Hungary, and the Rothbard Institute of Poland, and the Mises Institute of Lithuania, and all of these things. Who are these people? Well, they all demand that America support Ukraine at war with Russia. And they all demanded that Ted Galen Carpenter be fired from the Cato Institute for opposing this policy. Now, Ted hasn't been perfect on everything. He's a little, slipped a little bit on some of the war on terrorism stuff, but he has been absolutely fantastic on the Cold War in Eastern Europe, and of course is right up there with Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and everyone who opposed NATO expansion in the very first place. He wrote a book against it in 1994 and has always been so good at explaining how American NATO expansion in Eastern Europe would end up causing problems for the United States and end up provoking a terrible reaction from the Russians. And then what did Cato do? Instead of standing by their best guy, who they employed for generations there, they fired him for being too good on American intervention. But the silver lining is I hired him. So now he writes for the Libertarian Institute and for antiwar.com. And now I actually have even worse news, which is the Foundation for Economic Education, which has been, they're not especially, centered around foreign policy, but they've been essentially good on foreign policy with our movement this whole time. But they got a new boss over there, and he's at worst a hawk, at best a coward. And under pressure, again, from the Ukraine lobby, he actually deleted a bunch of articles from the FEE site opposing American intervention in the war and fired the guy who wrote them, a guy named Philip Carroll. He's also now going to be writing for us at the Institute. So this is a big deal. There is still a fight for the heart of libertarianism, when in fact, we already won this argument, and we won it big, because those of us who opposed Iraq War II and the rest of the Middle East wars, we were absolutely proven right. And all what we called them then, the Liberventionists from 25 years ago, they all had to shut the hell up. So the fact that they're trying to come back now and trying to make inroads into our movement now is a call to action for the rest of us, that we speak up and we make our point clear that no, in America's libertarian movement, regardless of whatever money gets passed around by USAID in Eastern Europe, around here, we're Ron Paul folk and we're non-interventionists on foreign policy. There's no way we're gonna let them get away with that. And that's all of us. And if you disagree with that, that's fine, but that just means you're not a libertarian. And Ukraine proves the point, as well as any of the Middle East disasters that we've witnessed over the past generation. And of course, Justin Raimondo and Dr. Ron Paul and all the rest of our great heroes were great on Ukraine the whole time. And of course, it should always be mentioned when we talk about the greatness of Ron Paul, especially on foreign policy, we always have to stop and give credit to his right-hand man, the great Dan McAdams as well. And now, they were right. Of course they were right about NATO expansion. And they were right, of course, that it was the neoconservatives, our same old enemies, who led the way on American expansion in Eastern Europe, the same way that they led the charge for wars for Israel in the Middle East. And how do I know? Well, I wrote a book about it. It's called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Don't be intimidated by the length. It's about a quarter footnotes. So it's really only like reading 3 books in one instead of 4. It's not that bad. But John Mearsheimer and Ron Paul thought it was good. So there you go. And we got some for sale downstairs. And now, because of time constraints, I won't be able to tell the whole story as thoroughly as I sometimes like to do. But then again, I think, probably most of y'all know a lot of this story anyway. But the bottom line, well, not the bottom line, I can fill some in. What happened essentially was at the end of the last Cold War, the Americans, beginning with H.W. Bush, before Bill Clinton ever came to town, they started spinning the Soviets. And George H.W. Bush told Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of 1989 in Malta that if you let the Eastern European Warsaw Pact states go free, we will not take advantage of that process. And that was it right there. And he knew what that meant, and so did everybody else. And I have that from the second to last ambassador to the USSR, Jack Matlock himself, explained. Everybody knew what that meant. Gorbachev knew what that meant. And H.W. Bush knew what that meant when he said it. And he meant what he said when he said it. We're not going to take advantage if you'll let Eastern Europe go. And then in the beginning of 1990, famously, James Baker issued the famous promise that America promises not to expand NATO 1 inch to the east if the Soviets would allow the reunification of Germany. Now, people say that this has been debunked. Well, I have rebunked it. They are wrong. They promised this over and over again. It was not just one promise by James Baker in one meeting on February 9th. It was numerous promises by James Baker, by Robert Gates, who was then the Deputy National Security Advisor, consulting with the head of the KGB, and as well as numerous statements by Margaret Thatcher and her successor, John Major, the Prime Ministers of Great Britain, by Douglas Hurd, their foreign minister, by the Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, and his foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, over and over and over and over again. They promised the Soviets, we will not move further east. Now, the wrinkle in this is that Baker's original promise was kind of confusing. He said, if you'll allow German reunification, then we won't bring East Germany into NATO. Well, but that doesn't make sense. If it's going to be reunified, and obviously under the West German regime, then obviously East Germany will also get that NATO war guarantee, right? So then they adapted it a little bit, but still respecting the spirit of the promise. And they said, well, what we'll do is we'll have a special military zone where we promise not to move Western troops or nuclear weapons into the former GDR, the former East Germany. And so that was what ended up in the treaty. And now if you ask James Baker now, or if you ask the New York Times now, they go, well, that's not in the treaty that we promised not to bring Poland into NATO or whatever. Well, that's correct. It's not in the treaty, but no one ever said it was in the treaty. Everybody explained that these were the promises that all these decisions were based on to allow reunification in the first place. And the Americans clearly were recognizing that and were respecting the spirit of the promise by promising not to move equipment into the east of Germany. Now, if the deal always was that, of course, they can bring Poland and Hungary and the Baltics into NATO and put military equipment there, then what difference would it make if they had military equipment in East Germany or not? And they knew that this was the deal that they had made, and they were, in essence, trying to respect it. And even when they changed their mind and broke the deal, and they created a new deal, they agreed the Founding Act of 1997 under Bill Clinton, they promised, okay, well, we are going to start bringing Eastern European countries into NATO, but we promise not to move any military equipment into them. And so again, sort of conceding that they're breaking the promise, but still trying to half respect it. And see, part of it too was that they had promised the Soviets that actually it doesn't even matter. There is no NATO expansion. That's kind of irrelevant because what we're going to do is we're going to make NATO a political organization. Think of like the EU plus America. And we're going to replace it as an alliance with a new security partnership Because who needs an alliance? We don't have any enemies anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring Russia and all of the Eastern European states who are already members of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, now known as the OSCE. We're going to make that the security partnership for Europe, and that will be the forum in which we solve Europe's problems nonviolently. And see, that way, Ukraine and Baltic and Belarusian and everybody's independence is baked in. Russia and they are all brought in together at the same time. But the thing is, they were lying, and they knew that they were lying. From the H.W. Bush government and through Bill Clinton, the plan was always to keep selling the Russians that this is what we're going to do, while what we're really doing is preparing Eastern European countries for NATO expansion. In the Bill Clinton years, they replaced the CSCE with a new regime called the Partnership for Peace, but again pushed the same lie, that we're doing this instead of NATO. And Russia and Ukraine and the rest of the Eastern European countries will all be brought in all at the same time. So everybody's neutrality is baked in, and there's nothing for any of these countries to be jealous about or fight about. But it was all a scam. And they knew they were lying, and from the time of Bush Sr., and then when Bill Clinton came in, he ended up pushing the same agenda while calling it something else. Now, I'll skip the shock therapy, other than to say that, as people in this room might guess, it was not a case of too much free market capitalism too soon, as in the conventional wisdom. It was a case of not enough free market capitalism too soon. Because you know what? They didn't send the Austrians from Auburn, Alabama, and they didn't even send the Chicago school. They sent the Harvard boys, the neoliberals, right, who don't really understand or appreciate capitalist theory or why freedom works at all. Right? So they were exporting what Bill Clinton called free markets and democracy circa mid-1990s is what they were exporting to Russia. And so what that meant was there's still a huge amount of cronyism built into the economy. They still had a communist from the ancient regime in charge of the central bank who wouldn't stop printing money. And instead of insisting on a strict regime of property rights and of contracts and the very basic building blocks of a capitalist society, instead they went around picking winners and losers and saying, we want to connect with this guy and this guy and this guy, whoever speaks English best, who's ever willing to suck up to the Americans the most. They all get chosen to get the voucher schemes and all of the different methods that they had for quote unquote privatizing the Soviet economy, where they ended up, and very much with the help of the Americans. And the Russians are responsible for their own behavior, of course. The Americans and USAID was at the center of this. They absolutely bear responsibility. They took credit for it at the time. That they were the ones who reformed the Russian economy, and they ended up turning the whole country over to 7 gangsters. Not even businessmen, but just straight up throat-slitting murderers were the ones who took over the country. So imagine a literal communist economy, the Soviet Union, where the national government literally owned everything, all of the industries, all the businesses, everything. And imagine them transforming from that to capitalism, and 4 to 6 million excess deaths are caused over the course of about a decade. Now, obviously, they had a severe transition to accomplish somehow, but the Americans helped them absolutely ruin that transition to capitalism. And this really helped to engender a lot of resentment against the United States and a lot of support for the nationalist right in the country and support for the rise of Putin as a strong man in order to make things right again, essentially to reassert Russian independence. And of course, the rub there is Putin was a made guy. He was part of the Yeltsin family. That was what they called it, right? Just like a crime family in New York. He was part of the regime, and he was promoted because he was helping guys get away with their crimes and get out of the country safely with their money. But then once he became the president, he asserted all this authority and sovereignty and moved to declare independence from the United States, which really helped to cause a lot of problems, of course. Also, very briefly, Bill Clinton to a degree far greater than I had previously understood, supported al-Qaeda in Bosnia, Chechnya, and Kosovo in the 1990s. And this was a big part, I think, of what caused the September 11th attack is, for example, when the FBI agents in Minneapolis wanted to search Zacharias Moussaoui's belongings because he wanted to know how to fly a jumbo jet, but he wasn't interested in how to take off or land. And they went, wait a minute, and they started looking at him. The FBI supervisors back in New York would not give them a FISA warrant to search his belongings, even though they had direct evidence from the French of his and his brother's direct ties to the bin Ladenites in Chechnya. Why? We like the bin Ladenites in Chechnya. They're not terrorists, they're nationalist freedom fighters. And so your request for a FISA warrant is denied. After September 11th, the night of September 11th, they finally searched his papers and they would have been able to trace him directly back to the hijackers in Florida if they'd been allowed to do their job. There's a FBI agent named Michael Maltby whose fault September 11th is there. So that's a huge part of it. Then George W. Bush comes in, he tears up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which also has the effect of killing the START II treaty, which the Russians had just ratified. And the START II treaty banned all multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles on nuclear missiles between both countries. So this decision by W. Bush and Putin's retaliation for tearing up START might be the two worst decisions that any human man ever made in the history of the world. I guess we'll find out, but we'll only know the truth for a couple of seconds before we're turned to ash. And then tearing up that treaty, the purpose was to put these anti-ballistic missile sites in Romania and Poland and the radars in the Czech Republic. And the thing is that it looks like maybe America is trying to achieve a first strike capability and cancel mutually assured destruction, which is, of course, the highest alarm inside Russia. But George W. Bush said, Vlad, that's crazy. We don't have enough missile interceptors here to shoot down an incoming salvo into Europe from Russia, so that can't be it. And Putin said, that's a good point. Maybe it's that the Mk-41 missile launcher is a dual-use missile launcher that can hold Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And maybe that's why you're putting these launchers in Romania and Poland. W. Bush said, no, it's to protect Poland from nuclear attack from Iran. Except that Iran doesn't have nukes and they don't have missiles that can reach Poland, and Iran doesn't have any beef with Poland, and what? Nobody believed that. Maybe it's the dual-use Mark 41 missile launchers that can hold Sparrow interceptors, but they can also hold Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with H-bombs. And then Putin said, well, what do you expect me to do? I can either try to build a bunch of defensive sites, extremely sophisticated, extremely expensive anti-ballistic missile systems like you, or I could just build more offensive missiles. Guess what he chose? To build more offensive missiles, and he debuted them in 2018, and he explained they have an entire new generation of heavy missiles that can go around the South Pole and deliver as many as 24 warheads from a single rocket, enough to kill all of Texas with one rocket over the South Pole where we have no defense whatsoever, and with a lot more to boot, as a direct consequence of W. Bush's brinksmanship there. And Bush also picked up where Bill Clinton left off with the color-coded revolutions. Now, some of you guys may know a little bit about this. Essentially, these are coups d'etat dressed up as popular revolutions. And usually what they do is they dispute an election. They say, well, our exit pollsters say that our guy should have won, not your guy. And this is the kind of foreign intervention in other people's elections that would drive Americans straight to war if anybody tried it here. Think about how crazy Americans went over the lies about Russian intervention in America in 2016. Imagine what they would have done if the Russians or the Chinese or anyone else exerted the kind of pressure that the United States does, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars in many cases into countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and other places in order to force these regime changes. And Bill Clinton got it started in the Balkans, and W. Bush pushed it through. Bill Clinton did Serbia in 2000, it was the biggest one. Then W. Bush comes in, he does the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and then also the failed Denim Revolution in Belarus in 2005. That was the second time they tried to overthrow Belarus. They did it again in 2020. And so this was huge. And then, of course, W. Bush promised to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And this was a huge mistake. And many of you may be familiar with what's now called the Niet means Niet memo, It was by a guy who was Biden's head of the CIA, William Burns. Hey, Phil, good to see you, man. And the memo is to Condoleezza Rice, and he was the ambassador to Russia at the time. And he's saying, Madam, don't do this. He says he's talked to every expert in Moscow, from the most enlightened liberals, he says, to the most barbarian knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin, and everybody at the think tanks, and everybody in the legislature, and everybody in between, and everybody is agreed. Ukraine especially, Georgia too, but Ukraine especially is the brightest of red lines for Russia. They are begging us not to do this. And this is Burns's words, paraphrasing Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, that if America goes to bring Ukraine into NATO, that could cause a civil war in Ukraine. And then that could cause Russia to have to face the choice of whether or not to intervene, a decision they do not want to have to make. Right? So this is Lavrov at his most diplomatic, begging the United States, don't put us in this position. And Burns wrote in his memoir that he was sure that Condoleezza Rice agreed with him, and the Secretary of State. And we know that the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, did, because he slammed Bush in his second memoir for this and insulted him, ridiculed him for this. Now, we don't know what they told Bush, but that was their positions. We also know that the entire National Security Council was against it. You remember Fiona Hill with the line for mouth that testified against Trump in the Ukraine Gate thing? She was the Russia expert on the head of the Russia desk on the National Security Council. Well, she and Thomas Graham, who was more of a dove and was the chief of the Ukraine desk, they were against it. And they said that they polled the intelligence community. They didn't do an NIE, but they polled the CIA and everybody else, and they all recommended against an offer of Ukraine to join NATO. The president of France and the chancellor of Germany both also completely freaked out and did everything they could to stop it. Why? Because it costs too much money? That can't be it. It was because it's an unnecessary provocation against the Russians. That's it. That was the single one and only reason that all of the experts said that we should not do this. And then why did W. Bush do it anyway? Well, as Burns wrote in his memoir, it was legacy building for George W. Bush. See, his legacy was supposed to be remaking Iraq. Well, that didn't turn out that well. He was going to go down in history, and they should have not said this until he was gone. But they were already announcing that he was going to be ranked among the worst presidents in all of American history. He wanted to seize all the Social Security IOUs and put them in the stock market bubble, the same one that crashed at the end of 2008 before he was even out of the office. Remember? They wouldn't let him do that. So what was his legacy? Nothing but failure. So he had to do something big, and this was something big. And so that was what it was. And he went ahead at Bucharest, and even though the Germans would not let him give a real offer, he essentially announced a sort of half offer to Ukraine and Georgia that you guys are on the path now to eventual NATO membership. And that resulted in a war breaking out in Georgia, which the American puppet Saakashvili started because he was trying to solve his border dispute with two breakaway provinces before this offer would come due. You can't have an ongoing border dispute and join NATO. So he was trying to take back these two provinces and launched a war which completely backfired and led to the Russians invading and taking back those two provinces and threatening even the capital of Georgia, which they did not take and could have. So this is an absolute, one of W. Bush's worst blunders, if you can believe it. I know it's a long list. Obama comes in, how much time? Oh man. Obama comes in, you guys know how I do. The worst thing that Obama did, and there was a bunch of them, was he overthrew the government of Ukraine again in the Maidan Revolution of 2014. And this resulted immediately in the loss of Crimea and then the outbreak of war in the East. And the outbreak of war in the East really happened, I think, because the new regime in Kiev and the Obama government were overreacting after the loss of Crimea. And they were afraid that they were going to completely lose the entire eastern part of Ukraine as well. And so they went to war. But then when they did, about half the army split and went to the other side, guaranteeing that it would be a real war between mechanized forces. And then they brought in all the Nazi militias who had helped to accomplish the street putsch to overthrow the government in February of 2014, and they founded a group called the Azov Battalion to be the leading edge of the counterinsurgency until the army could get their act together to launch the war. And it was a horrific war. About 9,000 people were killed in the first year until they signed a couple of peace agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, that were supposed to bring an end to the war. And they did bring an end to the airstrikes and the heavy artillery and the tank war. There's still some artillery going back and forth, and about another 4,000 people were killed, mostly combatants, but some civilians, over the next 7 years as the issue remained unresolved and as the Obama government and then the Trump government would not intervene with the Ukrainians to make sure that they implemented this peace deal. And this was a deal that was worked out by our German and French allies, but then was rubber stamped by Obama and the UN Security Council. So this was absolutely supposed to be the deal, but America would never put pressure on the Ukrainians to implement their side of it. And then he poured, and we also know from later reporting that the CIA launched the war, essentially that John Brennan came to town on April the 12th, and on the 14th they attacked. And that the CIA, according to the New York Times, built 14 secret bases inside Ukraine, including right up along the Ukrainian-Russian border, and ran the war the whole time. They lied about that at the time, but they admit that truth now. Now, of course, when Trump came in, he was falsely accused of being a Russian agent. I have 75 pages in the book on Russiagate where I explain the lie behind each and every one of those claims that they made against him, as best I could. I may have forgot a couple, but I think I got it all for you. And the whole thing absolutely was a hoax perpetrated by the CIA, the FBI, and the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign against Donald Trump. And they kept the thing going for the first 2 years of his presidency and change. And the FBI told CNN, well, if we can't overthrow him with the 25th Amendment, like they should have done to Joe Biden for being senile, then at least we can use the special counsel investigation to rein him in. This is the FBI saying, yes, we're going to pretend to investigate the president of the United States so we can rein him in and prevent him from having an independent Russia policy, prevent him from making peace with Russia. And that was their big objection, and they pushed it, and it worked. And you guys probably remember when Trump bombed Syria, his son said, now call us Russian agents. If we're Russian agents, how come we're bombing Russia's guy Assad? And Trump said, oh yeah, if I'm a Russian agent, how come I'm working so hard to prevent the completion of the Nord Stream pipeline? If I'm such a Russian agent, how come I'm pouring in all these weapons to Ukraine that Obama was afraid to? And actually, Obama did send in a bunch of weapons, but they lie about that. And even recently, Trump brings these things up. I was way tougher on Russia even than Obama was, he said. This was him protecting himself, right? Covering his own right flank from all these attacks of being a traitor. When what he should have done was just invited Putin to Washington and sign a bunch of new nuclear treaties and shove the whole scandal right down their throats. He could have just fired everyone at justice and then declassified all the data, shipped it to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and then moved on with his day, since there was nothing there for them to use against him anyway. It was all a lie. But they absolutely hemmed him in, and I don't even know if Trump knows this or not, but his ambassador, William Taylor, prevented another peace deal. When the German foreign minister Steinmeier came up with a way to resolve the conflict, the ambassador, William Taylor, told the new president, Zelensky, don't sign this. It's a bad deal. Don't do it. Don't implement it. And the Nazis were threatening to murder him, and the Americans were not willing to protect him from the Nazis. And so he was in a position, even though he was elected on peace, to put that on the back burner and to continue following orders. There was too much at stake. And now that I'm almost out of time, it's time to get to the war. When Joe Biden came in, the policy clearly was, well, first of all, I think the last straw for Putin was when the Zelensky regime cracked down on the last Russia-friendly oligarch in Ukraine, a guy named Medvedchuk, seized his media properties and the rest and put him on house arrest. And his daughter is Putin's goddaughter. So this was, I think, the last straw for the Russians, and they started building up their forces on the border in the spring of 21. And from that time, clearly the decision was made in the Biden government that we are going to threaten the Russians that you better not do it. But we're not going to negotiate in good faith with them to try to prevent the war. And the two major issues, of course, outstanding were the ongoing war in the Donbass, the civil war, and further NATO encroachment into Eastern Europe and further integration, the including of Ukraine as a de facto member of the NATO alliance under what they call interoperability. And this is where the American military comes in and remakes a local military as they're joining NATO or before they join NATO, completely set up their command and control systems, all their communication, and begin with the conversion from whatever their legacy weapon systems were to American weapon systems. And this meant that, in effect, as Mearsheimer and Walt said for years, that America was making Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. So, in other words, if the Russian Federation and NATO went to war, the Ukrainian military would be just another auxiliary army, just like the Germans and the Hungarians and the Lithuanians and everyone else under Supreme Allied NATO command. Whether they got a war guarantee from us was sort of beside the point. They would still be part of our coalition if we went to war. And so the Russians were making it clear, listen, we want a new treaty, and we want you to promise not to bring Ukraine into NATO, and we want to end to the war in the East. And the Biden government, again, would say, you better not do it, but refuse to negotiate with them in good faith on any of the important issues. They would promise to. And here's the thing about it, guys, as I think y'all know, America never had any real intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO, as Biden put it, at least not anytime soon, not anytime in the next 10 years even. They're way too corrupt of an economy and a political system, and it causes so many problems. Our allies are not with it. There's so many reasons we can't do it. But what did they say? They said, we have an open door policy. Now, there is no door, right? It's just jargon. What does it mean? It means any country can join NATO if they want to and we want them to, and no third country has a say in it. And no third country security concerns are to be taken into account as a reason why not to. As the way they put it in committee, well, does anyone here think that we should just give the Russians veto power over who we allow into our alliance? No one raises their hand. Okay, well, there it is then. We have an open door and no one can say anything about it. And so that means even if the Russians are telling us in the clearest language, this is going to lead to war, and we absolutely will not put up with it, as John Mearsheimer warned back in 2014. If we try to bring Ukraine into NATO, Russia will simply invade and wreck it so that we can't have it. That's how important it is to them. It's inevitable that that is how this is going to take place. And so then, as we now, I think, all understand, this was the Biden administration's plan. They thought, well, we can warn them, they better not. But you know what? If they invade, that's actually not a bad thing. Because what we can do is we can weaken Russia by supporting Ukraine at war. And at first, they assumed that the Ukrainian regime, that their military would be smashed and they would be supporting an Afghan-style insurgency. This is just months after America's final humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan and defeat in Afghanistan. And they go, yeah, the 1980s Afghan war, that was great. That didn't lead to any consequences that we regret or anything. Let's try to do that again. And so that was their model. Let's essentially go ahead, as Brzezinski said about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan then, well, we weren't deliberately trying to provoke it, but we were taking steps that we knew would increase the probability that they would. And then, as they said over and over again, we don't want to end the war with negotiations. We want to continue the war as long as possible to weaken Russia. They said it over and over again, and as I'm sure many of you have heard, so many American politicians, pundits, journalists, and opinion havers out there have said over and over again, this war is great for the United States of America because it's not costing us any lives. Russians are dying, but no American soldiers are dying. It's just great. We've never got this much bang for our buck. And in many cases, they don't even mention the Ukrainians at all. In fact, David Ignatius put them in parentheses. Boy, this has been great. We got 2 new members of NATO. Sweden and Finland have joined. We've got European nations boosting their spending on militarism across the board. Everybody's now like reinvigorated in the NATO alliance. It's wonderful. This war's been great for everyone, except for the Ukrainians. He says in parentheses. Ignatius is the CIA spokesman at the Washington Post, if you're not familiar. Very important guy. And that's the consensus, is that essentially Ukrainians don't count in this. They're extras in our movie, and this is all a method of weakening Russia. But of course, it hasn't worked. The Russians simply turned east, and they've saved their economy by just trading out who their trading partners are. Instead of Europe, now they're trading with Asia instead. Russia is the entire northern part of Asia, so they kind of have direct access. They have natural gas and oil pipelines to China. They don't need us. America said, you're kicked out of Russia. They said, out of Europe. They said, fine. And they're doing fine without us. And the bad news is that even though I believe that Donald Trump absolutely was sincere in running on wanting to end this war, I think he's sincere in wanting to end the war right now, I don't think he can. They're supposed to be meeting in Istanbul, Turkey right now to kickstart this thing. But the problem is Donald Trump was inaugurated for the beginning of his second term at just a bad time. The Russians are ascendant on the battlefield. They're winning. The Ukrainians are losing. That's the Western side, leaving Trump essentially no cards to play. He can try to send in more sophisticated missile systems. Biden already tried that. He can try to add new sanctions on Russia. Biden already tried that. So he has no sticks, only carrots. And he's got a pretty good carrot, which is, hey, Russia, how about we drop all the sanctions and normalize relations and become friends again? That's a big one. And, if you're the praying type, I suggest you ask Jesus for help in getting Putin to see the light and take up that deal. But look at the situation on the ground. The Russians are far short of their goal. They've claimed to have annexed 4 provinces, but they only control one of them, and they control only portions of the other 3. And they have the formerly Russian cities of Kharkiv and Odessa in sight. And there's a lot of pressure in Russian politics that says we've come this far now. There's no reason to quit. We got to keep going until we win. Got to take everything east of the river. And then, geez, you're going to really leave Odessa, the gem of the Black Sea and Ukraine's most important port? When we could take it back, it would be ours, and we could deprive them of it. And so they have a lot of incentive to just keep fighting until they've won on their terms. And the Western side essentially has so few cards to play that I'm very pessimistic that Trump will be able to see this deal through. Hopefully his carrots that he has to offer of improved relations between Russia and the United States is a good one. But then again, if you were Vladimir Putin, could you trust that? And the Democrats could win in 3.5 years, and then we'd be right back where we were again. And so it's going to be very difficult to see that all the way through. And I hate to leave on that pessimistic note, but I think that that's where we are now. I guess I would just add in closing here that when I debated Wesley Clark on the Piers Morgan show, and I said, look, but Ukraine can't win. He finally conceded and said, yeah, but we shouldn't be talking like that because that gives the Russians, the feeling that they are in a position of an advantageous position. But they know exactly where their forces are on the ground in Ukraine. They don't need to learn that from me. That doesn't change really anything there. Other than him admitting that I'm right and that he's wrong, that the war can end on any terms favorable to the United States. And then lastly, I would just point out that the worst power couple in the Washington War Party, Robert Kagan and his wife, Victoria Nuland, have both admitted that none of this is necessary at all. Robert Kagan said, you know what, now that we think about it, it doesn't matter to the United States of America who rules Ukraine. The northern coast of the Black Sea has never been an interest of ours. And he says, geez, if you think about it now, during the old Cold War, the Soviet Union, Moscow dominated all of Ukraine that whole time, and it never bothered us at all. He says, we think of that now as the good old days. Well, forget that. It was not the good old days. It was totalitarian slavery for hundreds of millions of people. But anyway, the part about it doesn't matter who rules Ukraine was right. And then his wife, Victoria Nuland, in her exit interview, scoffed at Russia and said, boy, all this talk that if we don't stop Russia in the Donbass, they're going to be marching into Warsaw and Berlin. Pfft, what a joke that is, huh? What a paper tiger Russia's military turned out to be after all, huh? Sure, they have the capability to hold on to eastern Ukraine. There's no way that the Ukrainians can roll back any Russian gains that they've made in the country, sure. No question there. But do they have the ability to take on Poland and the Baltics and Germany and France and Britain? Come on. Even Victoria Nuland says that's a hoax. It's a ridiculous hoax. You don't have to believe that there's any threat from Russia to Western Europe because there is not one. And if that's good enough for them, and that fits right into my confirmation bias, I think that that's perfectly right, and that ought to be good enough for the rest of us too. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. We're going to take a 20-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:30 to hear the great Ilana Mercer. Folks, we're about to get started again. If you can take your seats. Tell the people out in the hall to get in here. Or not. Okay. Somebody warned the people out in the hall that it's 11:30. We need an electric cattle prod is what we need. I don't want 50 people to come walking in the middle of her talk. What do they think? Okay, well, shut the doors then. Shut the doors, that'll get them to come in. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker is Ilana Mercer. She's a paleo-libertarian author, essayist, and theorist. She grew up in Israel until fleeing at age 19 to avoid compulsory military service in the IDF. She has been focused on first principles writing since her 1998 weekly column in Canada. Upon arriving in the U.S. in 2002, her weekly column was quickly syndicated. Ilana's national syndication fell through shortly after due to writing in strident opposition to the war in Iraq. It reminded me of my old friend, the late Ron Smith, had a big radio show in Baltimore, and he lost 40% of his audience immediately by opposing the Iraq war, but he eventually got it all back because he convinced his audience that he was right. Anyway, since October of 2023, Ilana Mercer's focus has been on the topic of genocide. So you know she's one tough cookie to focus on genocide in her writing. So Ilana, come on up here.
I don't need a little... I'm good with the microphone? Okay. People tell me I speak too softly, except when I shout at my husband. So, deepest gratitude to our beloved Lou Rockwell and to my... and to my good friend, Dr. Tom DiLorenzo, for inviting me here. I'm thrilled to be with you. My topic is the real Israel versus Hasbara history. Hopefully some of you know what Hasbara is. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. All right, not to move, not to be animated. When America's regime historians reflect on history's tragedies and travesties, they always praise Pax Americana. That is the idea that American empire, hegemony, brought peace to the world. Conveniently, they leave out the horrors of it. Naturally, regime historians, the ones we are here to counter, speak a lot about Hitler. They hardly ever mention Hiroshima. Likewise has Israel shaped its past, mixing some history with myth to render a myth history. The propaganda sustaining Israel's counterfeit history is called Hasbara, which means explanation in Hebrew. Hasbara constructs serve to coat Israel's real crimes against humanity with ideological respectability, to give them these some purity of purpose. Think of Hasbara as the steady supply of bogus, artificial constructs to rape reality. Think of Hasbara. Undeniably, compared to Hasbara, American foreign policy has a certain narrative talent. The injustices of imperial power notwithstanding, people are persuaded by the strut of it. Less obvious is the appeal of Israeli Hasbara and the Jewish supremacy that goes with it, and has seduced so many Christians into ignoring Christ's teachings. Christ commands care not for the oppressor and the predator, but for the poor and the oppressed. Hasbara and official myth history aside, because of Gaza, you don't have to know much history at all to arrive at the truth about Israel. Reality is truth. The reality of genocide gives rise to irrefutable truths. Because of Gazans, the living and the martyred, the truth about Israel is now ahistoric. Shortly after October 7, with the commencement in Gaza of Israel's Operation Swords of Iron, certain self-evident truths became crystal clear. By late October, Israel's actions within and without Gaza had shown the world the absolute depravity of Israel, state and civil society. Thanks. One such emerged reality is that Palestinians, not Israeli Jews, as Hasbara teaches, are the most imperiled people in the world. Israelis, the most perilous. Another is that Israel, with overwhelming support from the Jewish Israeli public, has gleefully engaged in methodical, indiscriminate, industrial-scale murder and ethnic cleansing ongoing. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, were allowed to obliterate the fundamentals of physical, national, and economic life in Gaza, turning it into an uninhabitable post-apocalyptic wasteland. The Strip has been reduced to its subsoil particulate elements, only badly soiled. Gaza is now a mass grave along a small stretch of the Mediterranean Sea where living ghosts wander. Gaza's soil is soaked through with a mix of millions of tons of building debris, the decaying bodies of tens of thousands of human beings, their pets, livestock, fauna and flora, all gone, an inferno of garbage, open sewage, and the byproducts and contaminants of munitions like unexploded ordnance. Said a scholar of the architecture of occupation, Israel has stolen from Gaza's Palestinians the very ability to produce food or receive it, or use means of exchange to get it. Banking was dismantled. Believe it or not, but under years of medieval blockade, Gaza's farmers had, before October 7, fed a third of their people. Indeed, Israel has systemized the mass murder and displacement of innocent Palestinian civilians, targeting them and their habitat for total warfare. Since war against civilians is a war on civilization, Israel, by extension, is the enemy of civilization. Our ally Israel is a country in which genocide, snuff films, extrajudicial assassinations, rape, robbery, torture, and starvation of Palestinians are de facto legal. Israel is thus a criminal entity and a threat to the comity of nations. The indictment against Israel ought to have been hermetically sealed. Israel's ethnocide and democide in Gaza is in violation of most systems of ethics known to man over intellectual history. It is in violation of God's law, the Ten Commandments. These command not to covet, steal, or murder. It is in violation of libertarian law, the axiom of non-aggression. It is in violation of natural justice, the laws of war, although genocide is not war, as well as humanitarian law. And it is in violation of the systems of law within which the above is subsumed, the natural and the positive law. Right and wrong are universal, not relative. The sixth commandment is neither opinion nor optional. thou shalt not murder or mass murder is called a commandment for a reason. There is no tribal privilege clause attached to it. Like Gentiles, Jews are enjoined against wanton murder. Yet Israelis now flout the sixth commandment with ugly audacity. Over the months, I have closely observed Israel as it pulverizes population centers across the Levant. I've listened in Hebrew to Israeli Jewish public and political discourse. In Hebrew, the Jewish Israeli public personalities and the public express an impatient, snarling contempt for accusations of genocide. Offering an unbroken stream of genocide justification, Hasbara. It's like Israeli Jews are yawning, waiting on the world to wake up to the fact that their lives do matter more, and that any aberrant action taken to make them feel safe must be allowed. And it is allowed. Israel has played its genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza to a packed house, to the world. Israeli Jews don't lack for facts, but most appear without the analytical and ethical faculties to examine their actions. They lead the unexamined lives of self-anointed superior beings. Societally, majorities appear to project the sense that their sectarian supremacy transcends the universal moral order to which international law, the natural law, and the Decalogue give expression. The natural law is a system of ethics knowable through reason, revelation, and experience, whichever floats your boat. Because it's anchored in the very existential nature of man and reality, the natural law is the highest law known to man and is therefore deductively true and just. An example is the libertarian non-aggression axiom. For reasons obvious, there should be no difference between how classical liberals or anarchists understand the non-aggression axiom, which is the organizing principle of libertarianism. Minarchist, anarchist, or statist, genocide is forbidden. The positive law, on the other hand, is the creation of the state. Legal positivism equates justice with the law of the state. In teasing out right from wrong, we discriminate between acts that are criminal because the state has criminalized them, as opposed to acts which are universally criminal. Most civilizing systems of ethics stipulate that no one has a right to kill a single innocent human being, let alone hundreds of thousands of members of a group. There again, Israel's sacking of Gaza is universally evil. Lest I be accused of arguing in circles around the definition of genocide, I'll briefly mention genocide in the context of international versus the natural law. Israel has aced the genocide bar, namely the prohibitions in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention on destroying a group, in whole or in part, and or making life unbearable for that group. Mens rea, intent in Western jurisprudence and judicial philosophy, is a component of genocide. If Palestinians were accorded equality before the law, any law, national or international, then by 2023's end, logically and perhaps legally, Israelis would have been seen as having both spoken their guilty minds and acted out their genocidal intent on the ground. Mass murder is never unintentional when you know it is inevitable and incidental to your mission. If you know in advance that your actions will cause the deaths of thousands upon thousands of innocents, attached to your criminal actions is a guilty mind, mens rea. America shares in Israel's genocidal guilty mind. The US regime has been a worshipful partner in Israel's vice. It has supplied munitions for mass government, the American political class, and its Julius Streicher media which even mid-murder describe Israelis as victims. On the matter of industrial-scale mass murder, international law is not at odds with the natural law or the libertarian law. Such is the case of the Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It articulates mostly a set of negative rights. Their enforcement imposes no burden on anybody but the sadistic, sociopathic serial killers under discussion. Most libertarians would concede that the state now acts extrajudicially, and that any remnants of the natural law once embedded in the US Constitution have long since been buried beneath the rubble of legislation and statute. Let us say then that to the extent that law, local, international, tribal, upholds no more than natural rights, law is okay. To the extent that law violates the rights to life, liberty, and property, law is bad. To the extent state law agrees with the natural law, to that extent it's inoffensive. By extension, it matters not who upholds the rights of Palestinians to life and land, just so long as someone does. Most should. Make no mistake, in human rights law, there is a responsibility to protect a community that is being evicted and eradicated. There's a right to resist. 2 under the Hague Regulations on Belligerent Occupation. Neither offends the natural law. Resistance fighters argue that they are heeding this calling, the responsibility to protect. Israel ought to have been forcibly stopped, its innocent victims protected. You don't placate a John Wayne Gacy and a Jeffrey Dahmer, you stop them, but not as the axis of genocide sees it. The Arab societies are non-woke societies. The fact that Gaza, the West Bank, Syria and Yemen were and are largely traditional societies, not co-opted woke societies, has certainly helped the West justify their mistreatment. You see, the woke masters of the Western universe consider non-woke societies as without the natural right of resistance. Their resistance we call terrorism. Given that nobody has effectively upheld the legal responsibility to protect Palestinians, all but the spirit of Gaza is gone. Consider the great Palestinian return to northern Gaza in January of 2025. The erasure of over 2,000 Gazan bloodlines, family trees gone, an epic event took place. Despite that erasure, processions of Palestinians in their thousands returned to their ruined homes in northern Gaza. You see, the land is central to Palestinian identity. What greater proof is there of the ancestral homesteader claims that Palestinians have to Palestine than this devotion, this resilience? Contrast this Palestinian rootedness and resilience with Israel's squirrely northern and southern settler populations. Israeli Jews have not returned to towns in Israel's north or south. Rather, their love of the land is predicated on its ethnic cleansing. Only if their army obliterates even the slightest danger posed by their indigenous neighbors would Israeli settlers return. For yet more of a contrast, look too at the repulsive levels of Israeli environmental destruction in Gaza. This speaks, among many other things, to Israel's profound alienation from an ecosystem it shares and claims to care about. Israeli Jews have agreed for the land, not a love of it. Back to our nemesis, the state. What about the moral authority of a democratic state? Surely our ally Israel shares our democratic values, or so we are lectured. Well, murder with majority approval is still murder, whomever the perpetrator, whether it is committed by the decree of the one dictator or the will of the many, by actors within or without the state, by the designated good guys or by the bad guys. Murder of innocents is always murder. You would be correct to conclude, however, that this 21st century Holocaust is popular. Thumping majorities across Israel's public and private sectors have throughout justified, finessed, and fibbed about their army's AI, high-tech driven depopulation and extermination orgy in Gaza. Eager to write the Palestinian obituary, as late in the genocide as February of 2025, 80% of Jewish Israelis signaled their support for Trump's plan for Gaza. Only 3% thought it immoral. Trump's plan is an extension and completion of Joe Biden's genocide, which included the internal displacement, depopulation, and large-scale extermination of the Strip and its people. First, Donald Trump has proposed to cover up Israel's crime of genocide, removing the pitiful exhibits from the scene of the crime. Next, he planned to conclude Joe's genocide by scattering the survivors across the Middle East. Israel will have been rescued. Gazans will have ceased to exist as a nation. The liquidation and extermination campaign in the Gaza ghetto would have been completed. Debating and committing genocidal violence, forcibly displacing millions, starving a subjugated population, all this many of Trump backers called out-of-the-box thinking. Who said crime doesn't pay? When the superpower inverts the moral order of the universe, the crime of all crime pays, and then some. In any case, genocide has won a plebiscite in Israel. No surprise. Remember, the IDF is Israel. It's a citizen army in which every Israeli must serve. It's the voice of the Jewish Israeli Commonwealth. Israel's sons and daughters are the stars in the country's genocide constellation. We've watched them level Gaza, vaporize young men picking their way through rubble as though in a video game, mock their victims, snipe their kids, rape their men, rob their businesses, rummage through the intimate effects of people dead and dispossessed, invade and explode entire residential buildings. True, all Israeli Jews are conscripted and must enlist in this army. However, the military draft does not compel a conscript to commit, chronicle, and crow over what is institutionalized, legalized, serial killer type crime. The pride and joy seen recorded and then transmitted to the world from thousands of IDF mobile phones over months has been voluntary, spontaneous, and organic to Israeli society's tenor and project. So please, let us hear no Nuremberg defense. I was only following orders must not be tolerated in mitigation of the IDF. The evidence is conclusive. IDF shoot, loot, and bomb for fun. No doubt the Israeli state is genocidal, but by the numbers and by their statements, Israeli society is as sociopathic. From janitor to general, from soldiers to Supreme Court justices. As uncomfortable as this is for us, for the libertarian individualist, the facts are clear. On the matter of the genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza, Israeli Jewish society does not stand apart from the Jewish state. Throughout, polled opinion in Israel was not split between Jewish Israelis for mass murder versus Israelis against mass murder and ethnic cleansing. No, the division in Israeli society has been between Jewish Israelis for current levels of violence against Gazans versus those for greater or lesser industry in what were already industrial levels and methods of murder. By the Poles, nothing outside their self-righteous and self-obsessed selves mattered to a preponderance of Jewish Israelis. Israeli Jews, by and large, have become a sorority of Jewish supremacists, and Palestinians have paid a terrible price for Israel's systemic societal sociopathy. Ask Israelis about Palestinian babies, shredded to bits, real beheadings, and they'll dish Hasbara. It's all in self-defense, and it's all the doing of a third party. Guess who made them do the genocide? Hamas. It's not me, says the criminal. Hamas ate my homework. I mean my conscience. This is Israel's third-party theory of culpability. Israel vomits it up, the West laps it up. The Hamas made me mass murder non sequitur exposes Israel's Hasbara for its irrationality. Since when do you blame a third party for your ongoing crimes in real time? Put it this way, the state in which you live has no right to evict you from your home and bomb your neighborhood because its agents believe outlaws hide in your neighborhood. The crime of passion defense is bad enough. The third-party theory of culpability must never bolster it. The crime of passion defense we associate with a single event, not with sadistic serial killers loosed for months on end on millions of innocents across the Via Dolorosa that is Gaza. Yes, Israel has an historic passion, all right, but for methodical mass murder. See, the IDF is not a fighting force. It's an air force. Judged from its actions over time, this air force's objectives are not to defeat a regular army, but to pound population centers into submission in Gaza, across the Levant and beyond. What other country has not only had killer practices codified in law, but also named? The Dahiyya Doctrine is named after the southern suburbs of Beirut, upon whose Shia civilians the Israeli Air Force has perfected its predation. Mowing the lawn, that's a term used across Israel to signal murder sprees periodical against Palestinian civilians to keep populations subdued. Fans of true crime TV, me, will remember the Highway I-5 serial killer. Imagine his killer craft being dubbed the I-5 Doctrine, and Wikipedia describing this infamous serial killer murderer of women as an originator of the I-5 Doctrine. Without a doubt, public protest too in Israel has followed a strictly me, solipsistic self-interest. There was little transcendent humanity whatsoever in Israeli hostage protests. Remember this. By the numbers and by their own words, most Israeli Jews were simply demanding a return of their hostages. Said one Israeli pundit, Israelis want their hostages back. They don't want Gaza back. If the Israeli state is a criminal entity, what then can be said about the US? Israel's war on Gaza, the West Bank, and the Greater Levant is America's war. Like it or not, Gaza is our genocide. We hear disinterested mumblings about the national interest. Don't talk to me about Gaza. It's of no national interest to the United States of America. I'm afraid it's too late for the national interest dodge. The US is an interventionist hegemon. It has aided, abetted, and partaken in, via reconnaissance, an extermination campaign in Gaza. Besides often being immoral, the national interest argument is a form of statism. The premise of national interest political pragmatism leads to this perverse logic. If enabling the slaughter of Gazans and Iraqis happened to be in the American national interest, then those endeavors would have been justified in accordance with the national interest standards. In other words, if the US government considered genocide in the national interest, then genocide it is. America should act as on its divine rights as global judge, jury, and executioner. No, genocide is not a foreign policy matter, it is a moral matter. And the United States' energetic support for the Gaza Holocaust is a defining event in the annals of American foreign policy aberrations and in the national life. While American foreign policy is a museum of horrors, Gaza is now the main exhibit. Why is Gaza qualitatively different from foreign policy deformities that went before? Here's why, in my opinion. So far, America's foreign policy has been largely focused on regime change program, where collateral damage is largely concealed but framed as incidental to a political program. Again and again, the American masters of the universe have gone to war to make the world woke, namely, make it over in America's image, as well as make the world safe for Israel, of course. Mass murder within the American foreign policy framework has generally been secondary to a program of warring to make the world woke. Crudely put, be like us or we'll kill you. In Gaza, however, America has participated in mass murder for the sake of murder. In Gaza, Uncle Sam has finally achieved an official or formal inversion of all universal values. What the US has approved and assisted in Gaza is a primetime 21st century Holocaust. In a sense, Israel has effected a radical ethical inversion in America. Sects of Christianity can no longer distinguish Satan from God, mutually exclusive categories. They favor apex edicts over the commandment of the Prince of Peace. But you are what you do. The Israeli state is genocidal, not by virtue of its actions and the declared intent accompanying these actions, not because it has been denounced as genocidal by so-called anti-Semites and terrorist sympathizers. Said Jesus, therefore by their fruits you will know them. Another of Hasbara's aims is to frame IDF's ongoing extermination campaign against a population of cornered civilians in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as byproducts of war, as incidental to a just war prosecuted by brave fighters. If it's portrayed as a war crime, genocide can be dismissed as no more than a case of, oops, bad things happen in the butcher. True, Israel's genocide has been disrupted by asymmetric warfare from non-state Palestinian resistance fighters. But there is an enormous power differential between occupier and occupied. That the serial killers encounter organized regional resistance does not make genocide a war. So far, I've anatomized what Israel's state and society has done to the Gaza Strip and its people since October 7. But what have Gazans, the living and the martyred, accomplished? A great deal. Outwardly captives, Palestinians are truly liberated from the illiberal political propaganda that grips the West. They have made us see Israel as an irreparably corrupt force, morally and militarily. The genocide of Gaza has very plainly invalidated Israel and validated the Palestinian cause. A moral, sentient human being need know nothing much about the history of the region to arrive at this conclusion. Here's why. You've seen Israel for the contradiction it is. Israel, astonishingly, has engaged in the mother of all performative contradictions. Denying genocide while publicly committing genocide, effectively asserting a birthright to do genocide. Israel demands to exist as a privileged, protected aberration, carrying out satanic deeds with universal blessings and absolution. Think about it. Caught in the protracted, planful act of committing genocide, the guilty party, Israel, persists in claiming for itself the right to kill and deceive without being considered and treated as a killer and con artist. The chutzpah. To no avail, human action, as Mises taught us, is the undeniable key to man-made reality. Israel and the US have acted. They've been exposed. Ethnocide, depopulation, and homicide are never justified and can never be exculpated. To assert that you are just and justified as you carry out that which cannot be just or justified, this is to embody the most grotesque contradiction and to be less than human, less than coherent. At minimum, Israel deserves the revulsion and isolation reserved for entities whose existence is a confidence trick and a fraud upon us all. The same ahistoric Hoppian argumentation, God bless Hopper, applied to invalidate Israel, denier of the Palestinian Holocaust, to live his own lie. Deniers of the Palestinian reality, Ben Shapiro, Barry Weiss, Biden, Bibi, Blinken, Douglas Murray, Dennis Prager, would be parachuted into occupied Gaza. Genocide would become their lived reality, not their rhetorical reality. Running here and there as tanks advance on the denier, ducking and diving bombardments from above, as if you can escape the death radius of American-made 2,500-pound bombs. These Holocaust deniers would be recorded scratching for scraps, carrying jerrycans of contaminated drinking water back to nylon dwellings, climbing over kilometers of decaying structures through ruins and twisted metal. Our camera will find these Holocaust deniers queuing with thousands to use a single functioning toilet, plumbing having been destroyed by these raiders. The denier of the Palestinian Holocaust would be filmed up close, suffering dysentery, sepsis, and starvation, intubated, amputated, or C-sectioned without narcotics, twisting on a hospital floor smeared by blood and waste, listening to the incessant whirring above of Israel's quadcopter killer drones. The Holocaust denier will therefore live this absolute truth, the ontological truth of Israel's final solution to its Palestinian problem. The nature of Palestinian reality is as they've been telling it, QED, proposition proven. In conclusion, books are now being written, more about Israeli and Jewish anguish than about the victims. Being Jewish after Gaza is one. Israel's theocracy, Israel's moral and military degeneration, Israel's looming collapse. When did it begin? Right wing, left wing, why? Everyone is beating on breast about Israel. An apt response are the words of a character from Southern literature. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And neither should you worry about the perpetrators of genocide only to the extent that punishment is exacted upon Israel for what it has done to the Palestinians, that reparations and restitution are extracted from Israel in perpetuity for the Palestinians. Thank you.
We'll now take a lunch break until 1:30 downstairs and out the door. We have one hot dog for every one of you.